Good morning, Bitcoin. My name is Thomas Hunt, and this is Proof of Work, a show about the people behind Bitcoin and how they got here. We're joined by
Wasim Al-Sindi.
Wasim Al-Sindi, and where are you from?
I'm from an independent research lab called Parallel Industries.
Very cool. Parallel Industries sounds like it's working side by side with something else.
Yeah, perhaps subverting some kind of existing industry system.
Well, of course, you've got a great logo on your shirt, so you're ready for anything now. You've got the Eye of Ra watching over you.
Yeah, we're keeping an eye out. We're keeping an eye out.
Very cool. Well, we just want to get started with everyone's favorite and most familiar question. What was your first computer?
Right. So my first computer was a Commodore Amiga 500.
Mm-hmm.
But before I was about 9 or 10 years old when I got that.
Mm-hmm.
But before then, I used to tinker around with the Amstrad green screen computer that my mother had for word processing.
Mm.
And she also used to have those kind of hybrid typewriter computer kind of devices. Yeah.
We had a typewriter, but it was definitely not a computer. It was in an old box, and you'd plug it in, and it would become a typewriter, and that's all it ever became.
It was like the phones, the very first mobile phones with just a tiny LCD strip, and you had to like key back and forwards to see the next word. I mean, it was probably not better than an analog typewriter.
It was a very big deal to be able to just make a typo and delete it and to fix it, and the digital ones gave you that ability. So that was pretty amazing. So what did you do when you got the Commodore Amiga?
So back then I was 9 years old. So back then I was really into playing games, doing a bit of the kind of homebrew programming, as you know. So the Amiga was the successor to the C64, which was a really a big one for hobbyists and home computing. Yeah. So you'd get the magazines, and there'd be the recipe, and you'd copy it through, and then you'd have like the really, really basic racing game with the lines and your little sprite moving around.
Sure.
And then
What's nice about typing the code is you could edit the game, right? If you want to make the thing faster, if you want to give yourself more lives. Yeah. Sometimes we would go in and edit the save files of games and give ourselves millions of dollars in SimCity or whatever it was. And it used to just be a variable you could find as a kid. Yeah. And now I'm sure it's all encoded and encrypted, and it's inside the game. You can't just edit it. But you could back then.
And then I found this program called Octamed, which was what you call a tracker, which was a music creation software environment. Yeah. And so what you see these days, a lot of people write software in things like Ableton Live or Native Instruments, and you see kind of the timeline moving across the screen. Trackers would move kind of vertically, kind of matrix style. You would see the passage of time top to bottom, and you'd have kind of like an Excel spreadsheet with lots of little points. They'd be your channels, the columns, and then you would populate the grid with different hexadecimal values, and those would be referencing a synthesizer or a very short sample, because you've got, tiny amounts of memory and working memory. And then we'd be making kind of chip-tuney, demo-scene music.
Was it kind of like a music box or a player piano? You set down like a coordinates and then it cranks through and
it's kind of like a digital version of a player piano, but with much more flexibility. So back in those, Octamed was quite primitive, but then that great thing about software and hardware back then was that the constraints forced people to be really creative. It was the same with the games as well. I mean, the amount they could pack onto one 1.44 megabyte floppy disk was unreal. And then as things got let's say people got more ambitious, then you start to get games on 2 discs, 5 discs. I remember we got Microsoft Office on a PC later, and it came on 35 discs.
People today can't even imagine sitting there changing it in and out, but you really wanted to run the new program. I remember one time it was, on the playground and such. We got an early copy of Windows 1995 beta. It was called Chicago at the time, and it was like 45 floppy disks. And if one of those was bad during your install process, which one of them was you would brick your computer. You'd be halfway through the install of a new operating system and unable to go forward or backwards. But fortunately, the disk worked out. We got to try out the beta version. It was not very fun. Beta versions rarely are as fun as you think they're going to be. But still, to get your hands on something that, that's leap, that's new, that's hip.
Fresh.
So it's all about
You reminded me of the days after the Amiga when was playing with a PC in the mid 90s, a DX266,
Yeah.
and I used to continually mess around with the autoexec.bat and config.sys files all the time.
Sure.
Brick the computer, have to rewrite them again. There's no internet to look anything up. It's just like, we got internet in 96, so this was like 93
you
to
just
95.
try whatever you could think of, and different
Eventually
memory
it would
configurations
work,
for different games. Yeah.
But you learn so much from taking a thing. It's, I guess, like the stripping the engine and putting it back together, the digital equivalent of that, I suppose.
Well, and I was never afraid of computers. I always encountered this in adults and other people. They didn't want to push this, they didn't want to push that. I would push all the buttons. I learned Microsoft Office by going, File new, what does that do? File open, what does that do? And I just went, subject by subject, just trying to learn it all. And when I would break Windows, I'd reinstall it. And when I would break that, I'd reinstall that. And I broke it several times with Linux and then multiple partitions on the drive, and losing the bootloader, fixing the bootloader. Never really knowing what it was underneath, but being able to fix it at the top level and just generally replacing and fixing. But
yeah, it was much easier to kind of see under the hood and see what was going on with the MS-DOS side of things. So by the time I moved on to a PC, it was, gosh, I can't even remember the version number of DOS. 6.22 maybe.
That's a good one. I like that.
And then it was Windows 3.1. So with DOS, you could kind of you were in there with the working parts. With Windows, it was the proprietary black box. Yeah.
It was a long time before the computer would boot directly into Windows. We had a menu system. You could select what program to run, especially with the games. Early on, you couldn't boot into Windows and run the game. You'd boot into DOS and run the game, and then it would run really good. Windows loading the games properly didn't come on until 95, and then even then maybe 98 if you really wanted to wait.
Unless it was a really simple game.
Sure.
I do
all
remember
the Windows games, Minesweeper, those kind of things work good.
And I remember some, like, then shortly afterwards, the games that beyond the stock ones would be in Windows, but they'd be less resource intensive. They wouldn't be maybe the real time games. So
you couldn't play Doom in a window, really.
Even the turn based games, like I remember playing Civilization. Well, I still play Civilization, not number one anymore, but so I remember Civ 1 was loading into DOS, and I maybe Civ 2 loaded into Windows.
Maybe
I have to check that. Yeah, I'm not sure.
It was a big deal when they started having Windows native games, and we had enough RAM to actually run things in Windows, that kind of thing. But after you played games and got into music, what did you do next with computers?
So I played more games and I made more music, and that was pretty much my teenage years.
Nice.
And then I got to age 16, 17, and it was kind of the done thing in the UK where I grew up to kind of decide on your next step. So I was quite good at school, like exams and all that kind of stuff. So it seemed like a reasonable next step to go to university, and I was really into kind of maths and sciences and stuff. So I ended up studying chemistry, physics, and that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
So it's a bit of a kind of turn away from computers, because obviously the chemistry lab, I mean, even today, the chemistry labs are kind of like Victorian places. It's still like kind of Frankenstein's laboratory, smoking, chambers and flasks and noxious powders and all the rest of it. It's still like that.
Sure. And so from chemistry, where did you go from there? How did you get into Bitcoin, starting out in music and then chemistry?
Yeah, so actually music connects it all together. So I did my degree in chemistry. I really enjoyed that. And in the meantime, I was kind of like noodling with computers on the side. I did my master's project in astrochemistry, which is quite a kind of weird field, and that led me back.
Space chemistry.
Space between the chemistry of the space between the stars. So you think about the interstellar medium, which we think of as a vacuum. In reality, it's not quite a vacuum. There's a little bit of stuff there. It's not quite absolute zero. It's got a few kelvins of temperature. And so the chemistry that happens in between the stars is completely different to the chemistry on Earth, because here, think about a molecule, an atom or a molecule in the air. It's colliding with oxygen, nitrogen, everything else all the time, and it's reacting, deactivating, changing. In space, nothing's really hitting anything. So you might get a cosmic ray or a burst of gamma radiation or some high energy photons, and they might create an exotic species, and it might live for a long time. So you have this very exotic soup, low density soup of crazy stuff going on in space. And what we were doing was So you've got the starlight coming from a star far away, going through a cloud of stuff,
Sure.
reaching us. And we
Yeah.
observe that and then try to replicate the conditions on Earth using what we call high vacuum equipment to recreate these low temperature, low pressure environments to try and see if what we thought was going on was what was going on in space. And because I was in an astronomical observatory rather than a chemistry lab, everything was Linux. So I had two computers. I was in Leiden, a university in the Netherlands. One computer running Windows, so I could run Origin, my kind of graphical analysis software, a bit like a souped up Excel or R or something like that. And the other one was running Linux to do just everything else, and writing papers in LaTeX, which is kind of a programming language for typesetting PDFs and papers and stuff like that. So that kind of led me back into open source then. And then I did stayed on to do a PhD. I came back to England to do that in photophysics. So this was like using lasers to fry matter and see what happens on very.
It sounds very fun. I'm missing out on physics here.
The only problem with photophysics is because lasers reflect off surfaces, you can't have windows in the lab. So you spend your 20s in a darkened room. So you might get scurvy.
Not a bad deal, not too different from how I spent them anyway. But it's interesting you mentioned about the astronomical chemistry. I've heard the similar ideas with gravity, where we think, oh, space is just straight, and we're going to send the spaceship straight there in a straight line. But there's actually all these currents and all these eddies from all these different weights of the planets and such. So we could actually find a faster way there by following and mapping these currents. So I'm very interested in this idea of expanding our knowledge of space from just this empty void to an empty void, like you say, it's full of chemicals and it's full of gravity, and it's much more complicated.
It's uneven. It's anisotropic. So you know, one bit of space is not the same as another bit of space. At least once you go beyond, let's say, first order approximation. I mean, all of space is quite similar. But if you're really interested in the specifics, then you start to notice differences. And what is science? But
Well, and now if it's an environment and it's different, then maybe something can live in part of it and not live in another part of it, and then we can find some space whales.
Well, after astrochemistry became a field, astrobiology became a field. So people were then looking into ideas like, I don't know if you've heard of panspermia, the idea that spores, like mushroom spores, because they're extremely resilient to temperatures, pressures, radiation, spores could travel through space, seed life on another planet.
And then in an asteroid or on their own?
On either. Could be seeded by a...
That's strong.
Yeah, so if you look up, for example, there's a philosopher of the 20th century called Terence McKenna. He had a theory about directed panspermia, which is kind of related to this.
Like aliens launching these things on purpose, or maybe even mushrooms that want to live
just
longer.
Happenstance. Yeah, I mean, the spores are extremely resilient, so they could have been the thing that catalyzed the beginning of life on a particular planet or a particular moon or who knows what, and then the complexity might have emerged from there. But I mean, we don't have that much evidence, so a lot of it was kind of the conjecture and the dreaming, which is always nice,
Well, I always tell people, because I used to watch Star Trek growing up, and I still watch Star Trek now, but the idea of like the communicator, the engineers saw that and they're like, we could do that. And then they did. And then now I have a communicator everywhere I go, and the internet and the ship's voice that talks to you and all these kind of things.
Universal translator.
Yeah, these ideas, like first we dream them and then somebody comes along, I could do that, and they do it. And a lot of when I found Bitcoin is I was reminded of credits in all these sci-fi books and films that I read. And everyone always has these universal credits, and they don't really matter where they came from, but you have 1,000 and you beam them over to that guy and beam them to that guy and so on. And in a lot of ways, Bitcoin seemed to me like this backbone of society, this credit that we could use where it's not by this bank or this country or that bank, so we can trust it because it's not from them, and then they could trust it and share it with each other and use it as a medium.
So let me quickly skip through to the Bitcoin bit.
Sure.
So yeah, finished my PhD in photophysics, stayed on at the university a bit longer, managing research and doing looking after commercializing research, getting research out of the universities into the real world. Then I was running a record label and organizing music events, kind of experimental electronic music.
Nice.
And then that kind of became a bit of a thing. Not wildly successful, but I was in my 20s. I didn't want to be in a dark room anymore. I wanted to see the world, so I got to see the world with music.
Nice.
So I ran a record label called The Centrifuge. Everything's still online, actually. thecentrifuge.bandcamp.com if you're interested.
Cool.
It's all free. It was an open source record label.
It's a good thing you didn't put it on MySpace.
But we did have a MySpace, but we quickly realised that MySpace was this kind of like spam infested, you know.
Yeah, I can't believe they didn't back up that music though. It's just such a tragedy to lose
especially
so much
as
of
you know, like
people's works.
didn't Justin Timberlake and his buddies spend a huge amount of money on buying
They
MySpace?
did. They tried to revamp it, revive
Yeah,
it,
so they
and
didn't
it was
even
all
have
about the
didn't
music.
even
and
have
that's where it
second
went.
a backup of the state. I mean, maybe it wasn't worth that much to them. Maybe that's what it was.
I always we throw out so much of the human data. Like if the human clicks on this or the human clicks on that, that's something that the computer can't do. And more and more I've seen it where they are starting to value human input. Like originally you'd put data into a form on a web page, and if you refresh the page, the data's gone. Or you'd start typing a document, if you didn't save it and it reset because of power outage or something, the data's gone. But now I'm seeing a lot more of auto-saving, and even if you didn't put a file name in, they'll auto-save it for you.
Saving the state, the latest state.
It's so much better than it was before.
So yes, so I did the music thing for about 10 years, traveled around the world, ran a record label, artist management, organised some tours, created a festival in Sweden called Norberg Festival, and I was with some musicians touring the west coast of the US. I was in San Francisco area, Bay Area.
Yeah.
And one of the guys I was touring with, AFAST, he said, "Hey, let's go visit my buddy in Santa Clara. He's interning at Intel." So we went to his condo.
Yeah.
And he, we met and hung out. And then he opened his closet door and said, "This is summer 2012." He opened his closet door and said, "Check this out. I'm doing this thing called mining Bitcoin." So that's how I found it. Kind of through music, fell out of the sky into my life. Yeah,
that's awesome. It's so neat the way people find it, and I'm always envious of anybody who has a friend that's into it, because I didn't have any friends who was in it. It was just me, and I was like, I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know like if I should buy it or whatever, and then I forgot about it for a few years. Is the solution
me
I came
too.
up
Yeah,
with.
because he was a miner, so he wasn't really doing the exchanges or anything like that.
Sure.
And so
well, there was no wallet on your phone, and there wasn't even really a GUI wallet for a long time. You had to have command line, and I was into Macintosh, and I wouldn't get a PC again. And if I'd gotten a PC again, it would have been, mining or walleting or these kind of things.
I tried the client software out. I may have even tried mining, but I probably didn't get any coins. I can't even remember. I was on a trip I did a long trip around the States as part of the tour. I also did some stuff on the East Coast with music, and then I took the Amtrak coast to coast.
Oh, nice.
And up the West Coast from SF to Vancouver, SF, Denver, Chicago, Philly. And so I had lots of time to think on the train. There was no internet on the train, right? Lots of time to think, thinking about Bitcoin. And my family was originally from Iraq, and they had to leave kind of in a hurry, just as Saddam came to power in the late 70s due to political complications. And they kind of had everything taken away from them by the tyrant. So the idea of the money that can't be taken away from you immediately resonated with me. I immediately saw the potential of that. But at that point, it really was just like a science experiment. That's how I saw it anyway.
Sure.
And didn't seem like a financial, the thing with a huge financial potential immediately.
Well, and there were lots of other attempts at digital currency that came before that fizzled up and died and failed and even blew up in their inventors' faces several times. So it was not unreasonable to be like, this might not be the one. And we were looking for digital currency. It was going to be a thing at some point, but nobody knew which one would be the one. Even now, people are saying Bitcoin's not the one, this new one's the one, or that old one's the one, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I was skeptical. I mean, I was trained as a scientist. That's kind of like, you're brainwaushed into skepticism.
There it is.
Healthy or otherwise.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and so it wasn't really until, I just watched through the second half of 2012, 13, first half of 14, the run-up, the FOMO, the goxening, and it was after all of that ended, and like Bitcoin was just still going. Everyone thought it had died, but it was just spitting out blocks, doing its thing. And I was like, hey, this thing survived all of the thing that was supposed to kill it.
That's it.
Maybe there is something here. And then the second light bulb really went off, and I was like, there's something here. I'm gonna make it my business to know about this. And then just, you peel away the layers and you go down the rabbit hole. And I got some coins. I learned how to secure them. I started to learn how the network works. And I got interested in the kind of distributed systems aspects, the monetary aspects. And then I remember I'm not really a fan of New Year's resolutions, but I kind of think they're corny and dumb. But I made one for myself at the start of 2017, which was, you're going to figure out as much of this thing as you can, because
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
something there. And so I remember sitting I was in Eastern Europe traveling at the time. It's -20 outside. And I was
Oh.
watching, I don't know if you know the Princeton book and Princeton videos that went with the Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies book. I was watching like Arvind Narayanan, Andrew Miller, Ed Felton, talking about the stuff, like the technical, bits of it, and that kind of that itch that got scratched from the physics came back, and I was like, oh, this is nerdy as well. I can get freedom and nerd out.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting to me how much individualism there is in the Bitcoin education. A lot of people go to school and they're pretty much forced to learn about something, and maybe they get interested and then they get more involved. But for Bitcoin, at least early on, and for a lot of this, if you want to know more, you have to do the work, and you have to seek out the resources. You have to say, well, I believe this resource, I don't believe that resource. This book was good, that book wasn't good. But you have to go through that and keep learning, and it's a very individual thing.
It's kind of the lazy way is just to kind of consume the surface content.
Sure.
I don't want to name any names, but the websites which are kind of like magazines, and they talk about the most obvious things like the prices and the personalities.
Yeah.
And that's what I did for a while, and then I realized there was more to it, and I started to look at what was going on under the hood, like I did with the old computers, and, with the photons and electrons and stuff. And then that's when I really fell down the rabbit hole. And so now I've kind of just consumed my life, and I'm doing various kind of bits of independent, non-profit, open source research, and just nerding out to the max. Yeah.
Well, that's very cool. And what are you working on right now? Where can people find your work?
So I'll be giving a talk here at CoinFest tomorrow about a couple of projects I'm working on. There's a project called Forkonomy, which is doing comparative analysis of network forks to try and make insights about the possible futures of Bitcoin. So I had an interesting case of something called Bitcoin Private, which kind of did a Frankenstein's monster thing of combining two networks.
Yeah.
And they artificially created a network which was effectively a halving ahead of Bitcoin. So then we've got a data point about a kind of nightmare future of Bitcoin where the token price is low, miners don't defend the network, attacking the chain is trivial, and it's wrecked.
Yeah.
And then when I started investigating this thing, I started talking to people like Coinmetrics, and then they started running a node. Then they found this huge pre-mine they did when they made the fork. So it really snowballed into this kind of how not to run a cryptocurrency, how not to Bitcoin.
Nice.
Yeah. The other thing is this project called Token Space, which is I got really fed up of the mess of tokens, ICOs, and coins, and the lack of differentiation in the wider world. People just lump them all into a bucket, Bitcoin and ICOs, and so I wanted to find a kind of a thorough way that people could understand and compare the differences between them. So I've kind of been building taxonomies of assets of different properties to make a kind of three-dimensional space that people can easily understand. Even like a regulator, a lawmaker, asset issuer can understand the similarities and differences between these projects. And I'll talk a bit about that tomorrow. And you can find me, I've got a website, PLLEL.com, Parallel IND on Twitter. Just look up Parallel Industries, you usually find something.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the
Cheers.
show.
Thanks for having me.